Lieutenant General Arthur Percival stood in the conference room at Fort Canning in Singapore on the evening of February 15, 1942, preparing to meet Japanese representatives to discuss surrender terms for a fortress that Winston Churchill had called the Gibraltar of the East, and that British propaganda had assured the world was impregnable. Outside the room, approximately 85,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops waited in positions around the city, while Japanese forces numbering perhaps 30,000 men held positions from which they could shell Singapore's reservoirs and from which they could launch attacks that would create catastrophic civilian casualties in the densely populated city. Percival understood that his position was hopeless, that water supplies would be exhausted within days, that ammunition stocks were running low, and the continued resistance would result in massacre of civilians and destruction of the city, without affecting the outcome of a battle that had already been lost through decisions made months and years before the Japanese invasion began. The fall of Singapore represented the culmination of British strategic failures that extended back to the 1920s when the fortress was first conceived, and that continued through December 1941 and January 1942 as Japanese forces advanced down the Malayan Peninsula with speed and tactical skill that overwhelmed British defenses designed to fight a different kind of war against enemies using different tactics. The disaster shocked the British Empire and provided Japan with its greatest victory of the Pacific War, measured by the number of troops captured and by the strategic significance of eliminating British naval power in Southeast Asia. Churchill would later write that the fall of Singapore was the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British military history, an assessment that reflected both the scale of the defeat and the catastrophic implications for British prestige and for the defense of British territories throughout Asia. The Singapore strategy that British military planners had developed during the 1920s and 1930s was based on the assumption that Singapore's island location and its heavily fortified southern approaches made it essentially invulnerable to attack from the sea, and that the dense jungle covering the Malayan Peninsula to the north made large-scale overland attacks impossible for any enemy attempting to approach Singapore from that direction. British planners assumed that Japan, the only plausible threat to Singapore, would attack from the sea using naval forces that would be engaged and defeated by the Royal Navy's Far East Fleet operating from Singapore's excellent harbor facilities. The assumption that naval power would determine the outcome of any conflict over Singapore led to massive investments in coastal fortifications, including heavy artillery capable of engaging warships at ranges exceeding 20 miles, but relatively minimal investments in defenses against overland attacks from the north that were considered improbable. The fortifications that were constructed on Singapore Island during the 1930s reflected these assumptions about how attacks would develop and what threats needed to be defended against. 15-inch coastal defense guns were installed at strategic points around Singapore's southern shore, positioned to engage Japanese warships attempting to force passage through the strait separating Singapore from the Dutch East Indies. These guns, among the largest coastal artillery pieces in the world, could fire 1-ton shells to ranges exceeding 30,000 yards, creating defensive zones where Japanese naval forces would face devastating fire from positions they could not effectively suppress. The ammunition storage facilities, fire control systems, and supporting infrastructure for these coastal guns represented investments of millions of pounds and thousands of man-hours of construction labor. The gun crews drilled constantly, practicing range finding and coordination that would allow them to engage fast-moving warships with accuracy sufficient to achieve hits at extreme ranges where a single shell could cripple or sink an enemy vessel. But the defenses facing north toward the Malayan Peninsula were far less impressive, consisting primarily of a few infantry positions and obstacles designed to delay rather than to stop attacks from that direction. The assumption that jungle terrain made large-scale attacks from the north impractical meant that British planners saw no need to heavily fortify the Johor Strait that separated Singapore Island from the mainland, accepting the risk that some Japanese forces might cross the strait while assuming that British defenders could easily defeat any forces that managed to establish footholds on the island. The defensive preparations reflected strategic assumptions that would prove catastrophically wrong when Japanese forces demonstrated that jungle terrain was not an obstacle to determined and properly trained forces, and that the Johor Strait could be crossed using simple boats and rafts, despite British defensive fire. The Japanese invasion of Malaya began on December 8, 1941, just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, when Japanese forces landed on beaches in southern Thailand and northern Malaya, and began advancing south towards Singapore, along roads and through terrain that British planners had considered impassable for large military forces. The Japanese 25th Army under Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita numbered approximately 60,000 troops organized in 3 divisions equipped with tanks, artillery, and extensive combat experience from years of fighting in China. These forces were specifically trained for tropical warfare, had practiced amphibious operations and river crossings, and understood how to use bicycles for rapid movement along roads while avoiding the dependence on motor transport that characterized British forces. The soldiers carried minimal equipment, were accustomed to living off captured supplies and local resources, and could sustain operations far from their supply bases through combinations of frugality and ruthlessness that British forces dependent on extensive logistics networks could not match. The initial Japanese landings at Kota Baru on Malaya's northeast coast and at Singora and Patani in southern Thailand caught British defenders by surprise, despite intelligence warnings that Japanese forces were moving into position for attacks. The landings at Kota Baru were opposed by Indian Army troops who inflicted casualties on the assault waves, but Japanese forces established beachheads through sheer determination and through accepting losses that British commanders would have considered prohibitive. Once ashore, Japanese forces quickly organized for the advance south, assembling bicycles that had been transported in pieces aboard landing craft, distributing ammunition and supplies, and beginning movement toward objectives before British forces could organize effective counterattacks. The British, Indian, and Australian forces defending Malaya numbered approximately 88,000 troops in total, providing numerical superiority over the Japanese attackers. But these forces suffered from critical disadvantages in training, equipment, leadership, and tactical doctrine that would prove decisive during the campaign. Many British and Indian units consisted of recently arrived troops who had minimal training and who had never operated in tropical conditions. The Indian Army divisions defending northern Malaya included newly raised battalions with limited cohesion and with officers who had insufficient time to build the relationships with their men that effective leadership required. Equipment including tanks and aircraft was generally inferior to Japanese equipment, both qualitatively and quantitatively. Leadership at senior levels reflected peacetime promotion patterns rather than combat effectiveness, with many commanders lacking experience or imagination, needed to respond effectively to Japanese tactics that emphasized speed, infiltration, and aggressive exploitation of any weakness in British defenses. The Battle of Jitra, fought December 11th through 13th in northern Malaya, set the pattern that would characterize the entire campaign as Japanese forces attacked British defensive positions that should have been strong enough to halt the Japanese advance for days or weeks. The 11th Indian Division had prepared defensive positions across the main road south from the Thai border, constructing obstacles and trenches that commanders believed would channel Japanese attacks into killing zones where British firepower would destroy assault forces. But the defenses had critical weaknesses, including incomplete obstacles due to shortage of materials and labor, gaps between defensive positions that Japanese infiltration could exploit, and inadequate coordination between units that allowed Japanese forces to isolate and destroy individual positions rather than facing coordinated defensive fire. The Japanese attack on Jitra began with artillery bombardment, followed by probing attacks that identified weak points in British defenses. Once weaknesses were located, Japanese forces concentrated against them, achieving local superiority despite overall numerical inferiority, breaking through British lines and forcing withdrawals before defenses could be reinforced. The combination of frontal pressure and flank attacks through jungle that British defenders had assumed was impassable created panic in some units that had never experienced combat, and they discovered their training was inadequate for the reality of being attacked by infiltrating Japanese forces appearing from unexpected directions. The British commander ordered withdrawal after less than 2 days of fighting, abandoning positions that with better leadership and better unit cohesion might have held for much longer. The withdrawal from Jitra began a pattern of retreats that would continue for the next 2 months as British forces repeatedly attempted to establish defensive lines that would stop the Japanese advance, only to be outflanked and forced to withdraw again before positions could be properly organized. Each withdrawal demoralized troops who had been told they were defending impregnable positions, but who found themselves constantly retreating, abandoning equipment and supplies that Japanese forces captured and used against them. The psychological impact of continuous retreat was devastating for units that had never experienced combat, creating expectations of defeat that became self-fulfilling as soldiers assumed each position would be abandoned like the previous ones. The Japanese advance down Malaya's west coast road proceeded with remarkable speed, covering distances in days that British planners had assumed would require weeks for attackers to traverse. The extensive use of bicycles allowed Japanese infantry to move at speeds comparable to motorized forces, with Japanese soldiers cycling 60 to 100 miles per day on Malaya's road network when conditions permitted. The bicycle tactics required minimal logistics because bicycles consumed no fuel, needed no complex maintenance, and could be abandoned and replaced easily when damaged beyond repair. Japanese soldiers became adept at carrying bicycles across rivers or through terrain where riding was impossible, treating the bicycles as tools for rapid movement rather than as transportation that constrained operations to paved roads. The tank warfare during the Malayan campaign demonstrated Japanese tactical competence and British unpreparedness for armored operations in jungle terrain. Japanese forces employed approximately 200 tanks during the campaign, mostly Type 95 Heigo light tanks that were lightly armored and armed only with 37mm guns, but that were sufficient against British forces that lacked adequate anti-tank weapons and that lacked training in anti-tank tactics. The British possessed approximately 150 tanks, including some Matilda infantry tanks that were superior to Japanese armor in protection and firepower. But British tanks were poorly deployed, often dispersed in small groups supporting infantry rather than concentrated for decisive action. And British tank tactics reflected European experience rather than adaptation to tropical conditions where visibility was limited and where maneuver was constrained by terrain. The Battle of Slim River on January 7, 1942, saw Japanese armor achieve one of the most dramatic breakthrough victories of the entire war when a force of approximately 20 Japanese tanks supported by infantry smashed through British defensive positions in a nighttime attack that covered 20 miles and destroyed or scattered an entire British brigade. The Japanese tanks advanced down the main road in darkness, overrunning British positions before defenders could organize effective resistance, crushing anti-tank guns that crews attempted to deploy, and spreading panic that turned organized defense into rout as soldiers fled into jungle attempting to escape the advancing armor. By dawn, Japanese tanks had advanced to Slim River Bridge, which British engineers were attempting to demolish when tanks arrived, and overran the demolition parties before charges could be detonated. The bridge's capture intact allowed Japanese forces to continue their advance without the delay that destroying the bridge would have imposed. The air campaign over Malaya was dominated by Japanese forces from the beginning, despite British possession of airfields and despite having approximately 150 aircraft available at the campaign's start. Japanese aircraft, including Zero fighters, proved superior in performance to British Buffalo fighters that equipped most British squadrons, and Japanese pilots had extensive combat experience from operations in China that British pilots lacked. The Japanese achieved air superiority within days of the campaign's beginning, shooting down British aircraft in dogfights where Japanese performance advantages and pilot skill proved decisive, destroying planes on the ground through airfield attacks that found British aircraft parked in neat rows without adequate dispersal or protection, and forcing British air forces to withdraw to Singapore and eventually to Dutch East Indies after losses made continued operations from Malayan airfields unsustainable. The sinking of HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse on December 10, 1941, eliminated British naval power in Southeast Asia and fundamentally changed the strategic situation by removing the naval threat the Japanese planners had most feared when planning the Malayan campaign. The two capital ships had sortied from Singapore to attack Japanese invasion convoys, landing troops on the east coast of Malaya, operating without air cover because British commanders believed that capital ships could defend themselves against air attack through anti-aircraft fire and through evasive maneuvering. The Japanese located the British force through reconnaissance aircraft and launched coordinated attacks by torpedo bombers and high-level bombers that overwhelmed the ship's defenses through sheer numbers and through the skill of Japanese air crews who had trained extensively for anti-shipping operations. The attacks developed over approximately 2 hours, as waves of Japanese aircraft struck the British ships repeatedly, torpedoes hitting below the waterline where armor protection was minimal and where flooding could not be easily controlled. Prince of Wales suffered critical damage early in the attacks when a torpedo hit disabled steering and reduced speed, leaving the ship unable to maneuver effectively to avoid subsequent attacks. Repulse avoided numerous torpedoes through skillful handling, but eventually was overwhelmed when multiple hits in quick succession caused catastrophic flooding that the ship's damage control systems could not manage. Both ships capsized and sank with heavy loss of life, including Admiral Tom Phillips, who commanded the force and who went down with his flagship. The destroyers escorting the capital ships rescued approximately 2,000 survivors from the water, but 840 officers and men died in the sinkings, including many who were trapped below decks when the ships rolled over. The loss shocked the British Empire and demonstrated that battleships without air cover were vulnerable to air attack, a lesson that British naval doctrine had not fully absorbed despite examples from earlier campaigns, including the Italian attack on Tarawa. The sinking eliminated British ability to interfere with Japanese amphibious operations along Malaya's coasts and removed the threat that had constrained Japanese naval planning. Japanese forces could now move supplies and reinforcements by sea without fear of being intercepted by British capital ships, providing logistical advantages that further accelerated their advance down the peninsula. The fighting in central Malaya during late December 1941 and early January 1942 saw British forces attempting to establish defensive lines that would hold long enough for reinforcements to arrive and for defensive positions to be properly prepared. The defensive positions at Kampar, prepared by Indian Army troops over several days, included extensive obstacles and fields of fire that should have allowed defenders to exact heavy casualties from Japanese forces attacking across open ground toward prepared positions. The Japanese attacked with characteristic aggression, accepting casualties from British artillery and machine gun fire, infiltrating through gaps in defensive positions, and eventually forcing British withdrawal when flanking movements threatened to cut off the garrison. The battle demonstrated that even well-prepared defensive positions could not stop Japanese forces when defenders lacked reserves to counterattack penetrations, and when commanders lost confidence that positions could be held despite initial success in repelling attacks. The civilian population of Malaya experienced the campaign as a catastrophe that destroyed the illusion of British invincibility and that demonstrated the vulnerability of colonial rule to determined military attack. European civilians, mostly British planners and administrative personnel with their families, fled south toward Singapore as Japanese forces advanced, abandoning homes and possessions in attempts to reach safety behind British lines. Asian civilians faced impossible choices between remaining in their villages where they might be caught between fighting forces or fleeing toward uncertain safety in areas already crowded with refugees. The roads south became choked with refugees moving on foot, in vehicles, or in bullock carts, creating traffic that impeded military movements and that exposed civilians to air attacks when Japanese aircraft strafed columns they encountered. The Japanese treatment of civilians varied depending on ethnicity and on the tactical situation. Chinese civilians were often treated harshly due to Japanese anger at Chinese resistance in China and due to Japanese assumptions that Malayan Chinese supported Chiang Kai-shek's government. Malay and Indian civilians generally received better treatment as Japanese propaganda emphasized liberation from British colonial rule and presented Japanese forces as fellow Asians freeing the region from European domination. The reality was that Japanese occupation would prove as exploitative and as harsh as British colonialism, but in December 1941 and January 1942, some Asian civilians initially welcomed Japanese forces as liberators before learning what Japanese rule actually meant. The retreat down Malaya continued through January 1942, as British forces abandoned position after position, destroying bridges and infrastructure in attempts to slow the Japanese advance, but never inflicting sufficient casualties or delays to allow stabilization of defensive lines. The psychological impact on British, Indian, and Australian troops of continuous retreat was devastating, creating pervasive defeatism that undermined combat effectiveness even when units occupied positions that should have been defendable. Officers attempting to rally their men found that exhortations about fighting for the empire and defending Singapore rang hollow when soldiers had watched their comrades die in previous battles that achieved nothing except brief delays before withdrawals continued. The final defensive line on the Malayan mainland was established across the southern tip of Johor State, the territory immediately north of Singapore Island. British forces attempted to hold this line long enough to complete preparations on Singapore itself and to allow additional reinforcements that were being rushed to the theater to arrive and deploy. The defenses included extensive obstacles, prepared positions, and artillery support that represented the strongest positions British forces had occupied during the entire campaign. But Japanese forces attacked with the same tactics that had succeeded throughout the campaign, infiltrating through jungle to attack flanks and rear areas, concentrating forces against weak points, and maintaining relentless pressure that prevented British forces from organizing counterattacks that might have stabilized the situation. The final withdrawal across the causeway connecting Johor to Singapore Island occurred on the night of January 31, 1942, with British engineers demolishing a section of the causeway after the last troops crossed to prevent Japanese forces from using it for immediate pursuit. The demolition created a gap approximately 70 yards wide in the causeway, which British commanders believed would prevent or at least significantly delay Japanese forces from crossing to Singapore. But the gap was not wide enough to prevent crossing using boats or temporary bridges, and Japanese engineers quickly began preparing to repair the causeway while planning alternative crossing sites along the Johor Strait, where natural barriers were even less formidable than the demolished causeway. The siege of Singapore began officially on February 1st, when Japanese forces occupied positions along the Johor Strait's northern shore and began preparing for the assault crossing that would carry them onto Singapore Island. Japanese artillery moved into positions where it could shell Singapore's military installations and civilian areas, and Japanese aircraft intensified bombing of the city to destroy infrastructure and demoralize defenders. The shelling and bombing created thousands of civilian casualties and started fires that destroyed large areas of the city. But British attempts to evacuate civilians were limited by shortage of ships and by the reality that there was nowhere safe to evacuate them, given that Japanese forces controlled seas around Singapore and the Dutch East Indies, where refugees might have fled, was itself under Japanese attack. General Percival faced terrible choices about how to allocate his limited forces between defending the northern shore against Japanese crossings, defending the city against air and artillery attack, and maintaining reserves that could counterattack if Japanese forces successfully established footholds on the island. His decision to spread forces relatively evenly along the coastline rather than concentrating at likely crossing points reflected uncertainty about where Japanese would attack and reflected broader failures in intelligence and reconnaissance that left British commanders guessing about Japanese intentions rather than knowing them through effective intelligence gathering. The dispersal of forces meant that when Japanese attacks came, local defenders were overwhelmed by concentrated Japanese forces, attacking at points where British defenses were weakest. The Japanese assault across the Johor Strait began on the night of February 8, 1942, when Japanese forces, under cover of darkness and supported by artillery fire, began crossing at multiple points along the northwest coast of Singapore Island. The crossing operation had been carefully planned, with Japanese engineers having spent days scouting crossing sites, assembling boats and rafts from materials found locally and from prefabricated sections brought forward for the assault, and training assault troops in embarkation and landing procedures that would allow rapid buildup of forces on the island once initial footholds were secured. The Japanese selected crossing sites in the Australian sector, where defenses were known to be less complete than in other areas, and where gaps in defensive positions could be exploited by infiltration tactics. The Australian 22nd Brigade, defending the northwestern shore, fought hard to stop the crossings, with Australian troops firing on Japanese assault boats as they crossed the strait and inflicting casualties on Japanese forces during the vulnerable period when they were exposed in boats under fire. But the Australian defenders were spread too thin to create continuous defensive fire across all likely crossing points, and Japanese forces achieved landings at multiple locations where they quickly moved inland to create perimeters that follow-up waves could reinforce. The fighting during the night of February 8-9 was confused and desperate, with Australian units attempting to counterattack Japanese beachheads, while Japanese forces expanded their footholds and brought artillery and tanks across the strait to support the assault forces. By dawn on February 9th, Japanese forces had established solid footholds on Singapore Island, with approximately 13,000 troops ashore, and more crossing continuously as engineers improved landing sites and expanded the number of boats available for shuttling forces across the strait. British attempts to counterattack the Japanese beachheads achieved limited success, with tanks and infantry attacking Japanese positions, but failing to drive them back into the strait before Japanese reinforcements and supporting weapons arrived to stabilize defensive positions. The counterattacks demonstrated the difficulty of dislodging determined forces once they had established defensive positions, and the failure of early counterattacks meant that Japanese forces would continue expanding their control of the island rather than being contained in narrow beachheads where they might have been destroyed. The fighting from February 9th through 13th saw Japanese forces steadily expanding the area under their control, pushing British, Australian, and Indian defenders back toward the city through series of engagements where Japanese numerical concentration at points of attack overcame British attempts to hold defensive lines. The Japanese captured Singapore's main water reservoirs on February 11th, gaining control of the city's water supply and creating a crisis that would ultimately force Percival's surrender. The loss of the reservoirs was catastrophic because Singapore's population of over 1 million civilians plus 85,000 military personnel required enormous quantities of water daily, and because the water distribution system was damaged by fighting and by Japanese shelling that ruptured pipes and destroyed pumping stations. The British defensive perimeter contracted day by day as Japanese attacks forced withdrawals, with British forces eventually compressed into a small area around the city where approximately 1 million civilians were also concentrated. The humanitarian situation deteriorated rapidly as water supplies dwindled, as food stocks were depleted, as medical facilities were overwhelmed by casualties from fighting and from air raids, and as fires started by Japanese shelling and bombing destroyed large areas of the city, creating additional refugees who had lost their homes. The hospitals treating military and civilian wounded operated in desperate conditions with inadequate supplies, with surgeons performing operations without anesthesia when supplies ran out, and with wounded lying in hallways and courtyards because there was no space inside buildings. General Wavell, the supreme commander for Allied forces in Southeast Asia, flew to Singapore on February 10th to assess the situation personally and to determine whether the garrison could continue fighting or whether surrender was inevitable. Wavell's inspection revealed that the situation was far worse than reports had indicated, with morale collapsing, with units disintegrating as soldiers abandoned their positions, and with civilian casualties mounting from shelling that would intensify if fighting continued. Wavell authorized Percival to surrender when Percival judged that further resistance would serve no purpose except to create additional casualties, an authorization that acknowledged the strategic reality that Singapore could not be held and that the only question was timing of surrender rather than whether surrender was necessary. The decision to surrender was made by Percival on February 15th, after ammunition stocks reached critical levels, after water supplies failed completely with reservoirs under Japanese control and distribution systems destroyed by fighting, and after Japanese forces advanced to positions where they could shell the densely populated civilian areas with devastating effect. Percival concluded that continuing to fight would result in massacre of civilians without affecting the outcome, and that his duty to prevent unnecessary casualties outweighed the shame of surrendering such a large force without having fought to complete destruction. The decision was agonizing for Percival, who understood that surrendering Singapore would define his career and his reputation regardless of the circumstances that had made surrender inevitable. The surrender meeting on February 15th at the Ford factory in Bukit Timah saw Percival and his staff meeting Japanese representatives in a session that was deliberately humiliating to emphasize British defeat and Japanese victory. General Yamashita demanded immediate unconditional surrender, threatening to resume attacks on the city if Percival hesitated or attempted to negotiate terms. The famous photograph from the meeting shows Percival, tall and gaunt, sitting across from Yamashita and Japanese staff officers, the body language showing clearly who had won and who had lost despite Percival's attempts to maintain dignity. Percival signed the surrender documents at approximately 1710 hours, ending the battle for Singapore and beginning 3.5 years of brutal Japanese occupation. The surrender terms required all British forces to lay down their arms immediately, all military equipment and supplies to be turned over to Japanese forces intact, and to all British, Indian, and Australian troops to become prisoners of war under Japanese control. The approximately 85,000 Commonwealth troops who surrendered represented the largest single surrender in British military history, exceeding even Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown in 1781. The prisoners were marched to Changi Prison on the eastern part of Singapore Island, where they would be held in overcrowded conditions with inadequate food and medicine, until being dispersed to work camps throughout Southeast Asia, where many would die from disease, starvation, and mistreatment. The immediate aftermath of the surrender saw Japanese forces securing the city, disarming British troops, and beginning the occupation that would be characterized by brutality toward both military prisoners and civilians. The Suk Ching massacres began within days of the surrender as Japanese forces systematically identified and executed ethnic Chinese residents suspected of supporting China's resistance or who were simply educated and potentially dangerous. The massacres killed an estimated 25,000 to 50,000 Chinese in Singapore and Malaya through mass shootings and through individual executions, creating terror among the Chinese community that would facilitate Japanese occupation by eliminating potential resistance leaders.